Okay, let's unpack this. But before we even get into today's material, I want to ask you to do something for us. If you are listening to this deep dive right now, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, please do. It really helps.
It really does. It helps us keep bringing you these ultra detailed breakdowns, and you definitely do not want to miss what we have coming up on the channel. So today, we are reviewing an incredibly provocative, ultra long, and undeniably incisive ebook that has been making absolutely massive waves recently.
Huge waves.
Right? Is being talked about nonstop in the manosphere and among men's rights activists. The book is called Degeneracy Conveyor: From Illegality to Tolerance to Acceptance to Celebration and Enforced Participation. And that's by Conrad Riker.
It's quite a title.
It is, but here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just, a surface level complaint about modern culture. This is a highly structured, deeply historical manifesto aimed squarely at red-pilled men who feel entirely alienated by the modern world. If you want to read along with us, or if this hooks you and you want to grab the source material for yourself, you can buy this book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. We also highly recommend you follow the author directly at the handle at Conrad Riker on Substack to see more of his writing and updates.
Yeah, his Substack is very active.
So today, our mission is to unpack this book's central thesis. We're going to explore the argument about the history of our core institutions before they were, as the text claims, completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. We want to understand exactly why this text is resonating so powerfully with its target audience.
That is exactly the mission today. And before we really get into the machinery of these arguments, I want to firmly establish some ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, very important.
In this deep dive, we are acting strictly as impartial guides. The contents of this book are highly politically charged. They touch on the absolute most sensitive issues of our time across both the left-wing and right-wing political spectrums.
Absolutely everything is in there.
Exactly. So we are not taking sides today. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the historical framing, or the ultimate conclusions drawn by the author. Our job here is strictly analytical. We are going to report on the arguments presented, lay out the evidence provided in the text, and help you understand the mechanics of this specific cultural worldview.
Right.
Whether you agree with the premise or find it deeply objectionable, our goal is to impartially deconstruct what is being said so that you can understand the exact nature of the conversation happening within the men's rights movement right now.
I think that context is so incredibly important because the book pulls zero punches. I mean, it doesn't ease the reader in with gentle pleasantries at all.
Not even a little bit.
No, it starts right off by outlining what it calls the central mechanism of cultural subversion, which is what gives the text its title, right? The Degeneracy Conveyor.
A conveyor belt, yes.
So what does this all mean? The core premise is that the cultural shifts we've seen over the last few decades are not the result of natural social evolution. It's not just people naturally becoming more open-minded or relaxed over time. The author claims it is an engineered momentum, like a deliberate 5-stage conveyor belt designed to replace the natural order of society with strict ideological control.
Which is a very specific mechanical framing.
It is. Now, I want to make sure I understand these stages perfectly because they really form the lens through which the entire rest of the material is viewed. Can we walk through exactly how this conveyor belt is supposed to operate?
Absolutely, because without understanding this framework, the rest of the text just won't make sense. The author lays out 5 distinct stages. Stage 1 is illegality. This is the baseline where a specific behavior or ideology is completely outside the bounds of the law or mainstream societal norms. It is actively punished or shunned. Then stage 2 is tolerance.
So this is the live and let live era.
Exactly. This is where society decides to stop punishing the behavior. It adopts a live and let live approach. The behavior isn't celebrated, but it's no longer criminalized. Then you move to stage 3, which is acceptance. This is when the behavior becomes normalized and integrated into everyday life. It's just treated as a standard part of the cultural fabric.
Okay, so from illegality to tolerance to acceptance. That seems pretty standard for how societies change, but then it shifts.
It does. Stage 4 is celebration. This is a massive leap, according to the book. The behavior is now elevated, praised, and given special status. This is where you see dedicated months, parades, and corporate sponsorships.
Right.
And finally, the terminal point, stage 5, is enforced participation. This is the stage where you, the individual, are no longer allowed to simply tolerate or accept the behavior from a distance. You must actively participate in the celebration of it, or you will be punished, fired, or socially exiled.
Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, for the audience this book is written for, the red-pilled manosphere, I can see why this specific framework is so potent. It feels like it's directly addressing that sense of betrayal.
A deep sense of betrayal, yeah.
Because a lot of guys who maybe consider themselves traditional or conservative might look back at the 90s or early 2000s and think, hey, I agreed to tolerance. I agreed to live and let live. I don't care what you do in your private life. Just leave me alone.
Yeah.
And now they feel like the deal was altered without their consent.
Precisely. That is the exact psychological nerve the text is striking. The underlying logic here is that the live and let live compromise traditional men agreed to decades ago was actually a trap.
A trap.
Yeah, trap. The text argues that the goalpost was never, ever going to stay at mere tolerance. The objective from the very beginning was to move the culture all the way down that conveyor belt to stage 5, to enforced participation. The case being built is that activists essentially weaponized the empathy and the passive nature of traditional men to get their foot in the door. Once tolerance was secured, the machinery kept moving. It shifted from leave us alone to you must actively celebrate us or lose your livelihood.
So for the reader, this reframes the entire culture war. It tells them that their passive acceptance wasn't a noble compromise, it was the first step in their own displacement.
Exactly.
And what's wild is that the book doesn't just leave this as a theoretical concept.
Yeah.
It brings in some incredibly specific real-world examples to illustrate how fast this conveyor belt actually moves in practice.
It moves fast.
Extremely fast. One of the examples that stood out to me was the discussion around Drag Queen Story Hour. The text points out how recently this actually started. It was framed as a very niche, quirky, localized event in California back around 2015.
Right, very localized.
But jump forward to 2023, and the book highlights how it has morphed into taxpayer-funded events taking place in public libraries across 47 different states.
And notice the rhetorical shift the book highlights there. It went from let people do what they want in a progressive pocket of California, which is stage 2, tolerance, to if you don't want this in your local community library, you are a bigot who needs to be ostracized.
Which is enforced participation.
That is the shift into stage 5, yeah. And the text provides an even starker example involving the military. It looks at the U.S. Air Force in 2022, specifically a situation in San Diego where certain uniformed personnel were mandated to participate in a pride parade.
Wait, mandated? Like they were ordered to march in a political parade? Because the history there is a massive shift.
Yeah.
You go from a military that historically formally banned homosexual behavior, then you had the don't ask, don't tell era, which sounds exactly like stage 2 tolerance, and now you have the Air Force allegedly mandating parade participation.
Exactly. The text points out this absolute inversion. It notes that the Air Force has even created recruitment videos featuring uniformed service members waving rainbow flags. The argument here is that this creates a binary environment. If an individual service member decides to opt out of the parade, maybe for a religious reason or just because they want to remain politically neutral, that decision to opt out is treated as a sign of bigotry or a lack of cultural fitness. Neutrality is no longer an option on the table.
And the consequences for trying to remain neutral seem to be where the book finds its most enraging examples for its audience. There's this story about a warehouse worker in Toledo, Ohio from 2023. Let me make sure I have this right. The book claims this guy lost almost $200 in pay just for refusing to wear a specific name tag.
Yes, $187 in docked pay.
Unbelievable.
And the crucial detail the text emphasizes is that this worker wasn't protesting. He wasn't causing a scene on the warehouse floor. He wasn't making derogatory comments. He simply wanted to wear his standard company-issued name tag instead of the newly mandated rainbow-colored one and just do his job.
And because he didn't want the new one.
Because he refused the mandate of celebration. Because he refused to wear the symbol, he was financially penalized.
That is wild. It really crystallizes that stage 5 concept.
It does. The text uses this specific anecdote to ask the reader a pointed question. Where exactly is the tolerance in fining a working-class man for simply trying to remain neutral?
You can't just opt out.
You can't. The argument is that in these captured institutions, you are not allowed to just put your head down, do your work, and go home to your family. You must proactively signal your ideological compliance. If you don't, the institution will extract a penalty from you, whether that means docking your pay, halting your career progression, or just firing you outright.
Okay, so that establishes the what of the conveyor belt. The machinery is moving, and it's crushing neutrality. But the text goes much deeper into the history to explain the why and the who. It traces the intellectual architects of this machinery and it heavily focuses on what it identifies as the Marxist roots of modern institutional culture.
This is where it gets very academic.
Right, because I am not a political historian.
Yeah.
The book points directly to a philosopher from the Frankfurt School named Herbert Marcuse, and specifically to an essay he wrote in 1965 titled Repressive Tolerance. So what does this all mean? How does a 1965 academic essay by a philosopher connect to a warehouse worker losing pay in Ohio today? That feels like a massive leap to make.
It does sound like a leap until you unpack the mechanics of Marcuse's argument, which the book does in painstaking detail. To understand this, we need to explain like a 5 breakdown of Marcuse's theory.
Let's do it.
Imagine you were playing a game, and the referee decides that to make the game truly fair, the leading team's goals simply shouldn't count, and the trailing team should be allowed to break the rules.
Okay.
That is essentially what Marcuse argued for society. In his 1965 essay, he put forth a highly controversial premise. He claimed that for a society to be truly liberated and progressive, it must be inherently intolerant of right-wing or conservative movements, while being infinitely tolerant of left-wing or progressive movements.
Wait, so he was openly saying that tolerance should only go in one direction? Because normally we think of tolerance as a universal principle. I tolerate your views, you tolerate mine, even if we disagree.
Exactly. Marcuse explicitly rejected universal tolerance. He argued that giving an equal platform to traditional or reactionary views actually represses societal progress.
That's fascinating.
Therefore, in his view, true liberating tolerance actually requires suppressing the speech, the ideas, and the influence of the traditional majority. The text posits that this mid-century Marxist theory didn't just stay confined to dusty philosophy departments. It argues that this concept leaked out and became the literal foundational operating manual for modern universities, human resources departments, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs.
So when a modern corporate HR department punishes a man for expressing a traditional viewpoint but turns a blind eye or actively celebrates an employee expressing a radical progressive viewpoint, the book is saying they aren't just being hypocritical. They are actually following instructions.
Precisely. The text argues they are executing Marcuse's playbook to the letter. They are practicing repressive tolerance. Silencing the traditional male isn't seen by these institutions as a violation of free speech. It is framed as a moral necessity to protect marginalized groups.
Which completely flips the definition of tolerance.
It completely flips it. The book is telling its readers that the double standards they see every day aren't accidents or glitches in the system. They are the intended features of a system built on Marcuse's philosophy.
And the book makes the case that this ideology completely devastated academia first, long before it ever reached corporate America or the warehouse floor. It details what it calls the purge of academia. And some of these examples are genuinely chilling if you care about free inquiry. It spends a lot of time on Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College.
Yes, and Weinstein is a perfect example for the book's premise because Weinstein himself is a lifelong progressive. He was a biology professor who found himself in the crosshairs not for being a conservative, but for refusing to comply with stage 5 of the conveyor belt.
Right, the day of absence. So, for those who don't remember this controversy, what exactly happened there? How did a progressive biology professor get purged from his own campus?
Historically, Evergreen State College had a day of absence where minority students and faculty would voluntarily leave campus to highlight their contributions to the college community.
Right, sort of a demonstration of their impact.
Exactly. But in this specific year, the administration inverted the event. They asked white students and faculty to physically leave the campus for a day. Weinstein, applying classical liberal logic, argued that asking a specific racial group to leave a public space was essentially forced racial segregation, and he refused to leave.
And the reaction to his refusal was explosive.
Right.
The book points out that he was targeted by massive student mobs, publicly berated, and ultimately pushed out of his tenured position, while the administration and a lot of his fellow faculty members just stayed completely silent.
Exactly. The text uses Weinstein to prove a point. You do not have to be a right-wing radical to be purged. You simply have to refuse the enforced participation of the new ideological regime. And the book provides other examples to show this isn't an isolated incident.
Right. It mentions a Yale lecturer. What happened there?
In 2021, a Yale lecturer was reportedly fired simply for questioning a student's self-identified gender identity in a private communication. The institution prioritized the ideological absolute of gender identity over the lecturer's job security or intent.
And there was a Columbia Classics professor too, right?
Yes, a professor who insisted on teaching Homer and ancient Greek texts for their classical literary and historical value. But the administration and student body demanded these texts be taught through a modern decolonial lens.
Meaning what exactly?
Basically, analyzing ancient texts purely through the framework of modern racial and colonial power dynamics. When he refused to alter his classical pedagogical approach, he was pushed out.
So the book's argument is that universities are no longer places of objective truth-seeking. They are ideological training camps. And how exactly does the book say this ideological filter is enforced during the hiring process? Because it brings up these diversity statements.
This is a crucial mechanical point in the text. It highlights the rise of the diversity statement in academic hiring. Today, to even be considered for a faculty position at many major universities, a candidate must submit a written statement detailing their personal commitment to DEI principles and how they will advance them.
Before they even look at your research.
Before they even look at your research, the book analyzes these statements and argues that they are nothing more than modern loyalty oaths.
Like the loyalty oaths from the Cold War era.
Exactly like that, but with a new coat of paint. The text views this as a distinctly Marxist method of gatekeeping. Instead of swearing allegiance against the bourgeoisie, academics must now swear allegiance to equity. The end result, according to the underlying logic of the book, is that universities now prioritize ideological compliance over actual scientific brilliance, research capability, or pedagogical skill.
So it doesn't matter how smart you are.
Right. If you are the world's greatest physicist, but you refuse to sign the DEI pledge, you cannot work at the university.
Okay, here is where it gets really surreal. To prove just how far gone academia is, the book brings up the infamous Sokol Squared hoax from 2018. It almost sounds like an internet prank that went way too far, but these were real academic journals accepting this stuff. Can you walk us through what this hoax actually was? Because when I was reading this part, my jaw actually dropped.
It is a phenomenal inclusion in the text because it highlights the absurdity perfectly. In 2018, 3 academics, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, decided to test the rigorousness of what they termed grievance studies journals.
Grievance studies.
Yeah. These are the premier peer-reviewed academic journals that publish papers on gender studies, critical race theory, fat studies, and queer theory. These 3 researchers suspected that the peer review process in these fields wasn't based on scientific merit, but purely on whether the paper agreed with the prevailing progressive ideology.
So they essentially ran a sting operation on the academic publishing world.
Exactly. They wrote 20 completely fake, utterly absurd, scientifically nonsensical academic papers and submitted them to the top journals in these fields.
And we're talking about wild premises here.
Ah.
I remember reading that they wrote a paper claiming that dog parks are sites of rape culture because of how dogs interact with each other.
Yes.
They wrote another paper arguing that society needs to stop categorizing traditional bodybuilding as healthy and instead view extreme fatness as a legitimate competitive form of bodybuilding.
Yes, and it gets even darker and more absurd than that. They wrote a paper arguing that the act of meat eating causes rape, linking dietary choices to sexual violence.
That's insane.
And most famously, and this is the one the book really focuses on, they took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, rewrote it by simply swapping out the anti-Semitic language with modern feminist buzzwords, and submitted it as a paper on male privilege and patriarchy.
And it got published. That is the part that is just mind-blowing. These premier academic journals, the gatekeepers of this specific kind of scholarship, actually accepted and published these fake papers. They passed peer review.
They did. Not only did they pass peer review, but the reviewers actively praised the scholarship and the empathy of the rewritten Mein Kampf chapter.
Wow.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture the author is painting, why include this hoax in the book? It's not just for laughs. The text includes it to prove to the reader that these so-called experts, the people who are writing the theories that eventually become corporate HR policies and government laws, have entirely abandoned objective truth.
Right. It really highlights why the author's audience feels so vindicated when they see experts getting it this wrong. If the system is telling a guy working construction that he's toxic and needs to deconstruct his masculinity, and that mandate is based on research from people who can't tell the difference between sociology and a prank about dog parks, well, you can see why the guy on the construction site stops listening.
Exactly. The argument presented is that if the gatekeepers of academia cannot detect a prank claiming that men who eat meat are perpetuating rape culture, then their cultural authority is entirely illegitimate. The text argues this exposes a system that is completely obsessed with victimology and subjective lived experience rather than data, reason, or empirical reality.
It's total validation for them.
Completely. For the red-pilled listener, this is presented as ultimate vindication. The system isn't smarter than you, it's just ideologically captured and mathematically illiterate.
That perfectly sets up one of the most explosive sections of the entire text, which focuses directly on the core audience's biggest grievance: the feminist takeover of institutions and the systematic attack on traditional masculinity. The book argues that because these institutions have been captured by Marxist and feminist ideologues, they are now fundamentally hostile to normal, natural male behavior. The author literally calls this an institutional gynocracy.
Yes, genocracy meaning rule by women. The text claims that the rules of society, how we speak, how we resolve conflicts, how resources are distributed, are now being written by women, for women, while actively punishing men. And again, the author brings receipts to back up this feeling of systemic bias.
And some of those receipts are infuriating for the target audience. Let's talk about the family court example. The book cites this case from an Australian family court where a judge forced a man to pay $10,000 a month in alimony to his ex-wife. Now, logically, you might think, okay, he must have been a multi-millionaire CEO and she was a stay-at-home mom with zero income. But that's not what happened, right?
Not at all. The text points out the crucial detail that the ex-wife in this scenario actually earned more money than the man did. She was financially superior. Yet the court ordered the man to make a massive monthly payout anyway, explicitly citing her lifestyle expectations.
Lifestyle expectations, wow. So basically, she was accustomed to living a certain way, and even though she made more money, he was legally obligated to subsidize it.
Correct. And for the author, this isn't just an anecdote about one bad judge on a bad day. It is presented as concrete proof of a family court system that has completely abandoned objective fairness, equality under the law, or even basic math in favor of a feminist framework that treats men not as equal partners, but as disposable wallets.
And the book argues this gynocracy extends far beyond the courtroom into the corporate world. It pulls organizational data to prove it.
It does. It points to statistics showing that in 2022, a staggering 73% of university diversity, equity, and inclusion officers were women.
73%.
Yes. The text's analysis here is highly specific. It argues that the very departments tasked with defining what constitutes acceptable behavior, inclusive language, and corporate culture are overwhelmingly dominated by one gender.
So how does the book claim that affects the day-to-day life of a man working in one of these corporations?
The underlying logic is that these female-dominated bureaucracies naturally design policies that reflect female modes of communication and female preferences for conflict resolution. At the same time, they actively pathologize male modes of communication.
Which means what in practice?
The text claims this leads directly to corporate environments where traditional male traits like directness, overt competitiveness, or emotional stoicism are treated as HR violations or signs of toxicity. Meanwhile, female emotional expressions, consensus building, and indirect communication are treated as the golden standard of corporate behavior.
That makes a lot of sense from that perspective.
This is a vital part of the message to the men's rights activist audience. The book is validating their deep-seated feeling that the modern workplace feels like a hostile environment built specifically to suppress their natural instincts.
And the book says this suppression isn't just happening informally in the HR office. It's happening formally in the field of psychology itself. This is a really dense part of the book. It zeroes in heavily on the American Psychological Association, the APA. It brings up a 33-page manifesto the APA released back in 2019. Can you explain what this document was and why the author is so furious about it?
In 2019, the APA released their first ever official guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. In this document, the APA explicitly stated that traditional masculinity ideology has been shown to limit male psychological development, negatively influence their mental health, and the document even linked traditional masculinity to mass shootings and workplace stress.
So the highest psychological authority in the United States essentially put out a paper saying that acting like a traditional man is a psychological disorder that causes violence.
That is exactly how the text interprets it. The author is absolutely livid about this. He points out the incredible, maddening double bind this creates for men in modern society. On one hand, society still demands that men perform traditional roles. They are shamed if they lack masculine traits, if they can't provide financially, protect their families, or lead in a crisis. But on the other hand, the moment they actually exhibit those exact same protective, competitive traits, the psychological establishment demonizes them as toxic and unstable.
It's a game you literally cannot win. If you're weak, you're a loser. If you're strong, you're toxic. How does the book suggest men navigate this? Because it seems to rely heavily on evolutionary biology to counter the APA's claims.
It does. The text grounds its definition of masculinity strictly in biology, actively rejecting the prevailing academic view that gender roles are merely arbitrary social constructs invented by a patriarchy. From the author's perspective, men are evolutionarily and biologically built over millions of years to protect and provide.
Right, it goes back to survival.
The text argues that testosterone, physical strength, and the psychological drive to compete, build, and conquer are not toxic artifacts of an oppressive society. They are the fundamental biological realities that built human civilization in the first place.
So when the APA says traditional masculinity is harmful, the author is saying they're essentially calling human nature harmful.
Precisely. When the APA pathologizes traditional masculinity, the text argues they're pathologizing nature itself. The author tells his readers directly, the reason you feel so alienated, so anxious, and so depressed is not because there is something inherently broken within you. It is because you are a biological creature living in a civilization that is actively trying to medicate and suppress your core biological nature.
Wow.
The text views the entire concept of toxic masculinity not as a legitimate psychological diagnosis, but as a misandrist weapon used to break the male spirit and ensure unquestioning compliance with the new feminized institutional order.
Which leads right into the book's complete deconstruction of what it calls the myth of gender equality and the death of merit. And this is where it tackles the STEM gap: science, technology, engineering, and math. So we all know the mainstream narrative. There aren't enough women in engineering because of hidden systemic sexism, old boys clubs, and a lack of inclusive environments, right? That's what we hear constantly. But the author argues something completely different. How does he explain the massive push we see for women in STEM and why it's fundamentally flawed?
To dismantle the mainstream narrative, the text pulls data from the National Science Foundation from 2021. This data shows that women actually earned 57% of all PhDs in the life sciences, biology, health, things like that. But they only earn 22% of the PhDs in engineering.
Wait, so women are already dominating certain high-level science fields. That kind of pokes a hole in the idea that universities are just keeping women out of science across the board.
Exactly. The text argues that the disparity in engineering isn't caused by oppression or sexism at all. It's caused by free choice and deeply ingrained biological differences in interest. To prove this point, the book unpacks a really fascinating sociological phenomenon often referred to as the gender equality paradox, and it specifically uses the example of Iceland.
Iceland? Okay, so Iceland is always held up as the gold standard for progressive gender politics. What happened there?
Iceland is frequently ranked as one of the most gender-equal countries on the planet. They essentially banned gender-based job segregation, mandated equal pay structures, and pushed massively for total equality of opportunity from childhood onward. They leveled the playing field completely. But the text points out that when Iceland did this, female enrollment in fields like electrical engineering and computer science actually dropped.
It dropped. That makes no sense. If you remove all the societal barriers, shouldn't it be a 50-50 split?
Not according to the biological argument. The text argues that when women were given total financial security and total freedom of choice, they didn't flock to high-risk, things-oriented, highly abstract engineering jobs. Instead, they gravitated even more heavily toward people-oriented, communicative professions like nursing, teaching, and human resources. The underlying logic here is that men and women, when viewed on a macro population level, inherently choose different fields because they have different biological predispositions.
So the argument is that men are just naturally more interested in things and women are more interested in people.
Broadly, yes. The text asserts that men are biologically more willing to take extreme physical and financial risks, more willing to work 80-hour weeks in dangerous or isolated conditions, and more focused on non-human systems like coding or structural engineering. Women, conversely, prefer lower risk, highly social, empathetic, and communicative fields.
And the tragedy, according to the book, is that instead of accepting this biological reality, that free men and free women simply make different choices, society blames men for the statistical disparity.
Exactly. When a tech company looks at its engineering department and sees it as 80% male, the corporate response isn't to look at the Iceland paradox and say, well, fewer women applied because of natural career preferences. The response is to panic. They launch massive DEI initiatives, hire highly paid consultants, and force the male engineers to undergo implicit bias training, all based on the unproven assumption that the men in the department must be doing something subtly oppressive to keep women out.
And what does the author say is the result of that panic?
The text argues this results in corporate spaces that become entirely focused on managing emotions and achieving demographic optics, rather than actually producing value or pursuing excellence. The book asserts that merit is dying because institutions care more about the visual diversity of a boardroom than they do about the hard, objective, ruthless results that traditional male competitiveness historically delivered.
Okay, so if we shift our focus slightly, the book then explains how this ideological shift is actually enforced on a day-to-day basis. And it says the ultimate battleground isn't just in hiring quotas or HR seminars, it is in the English language itself. It introduces the reader to the concept of deconstruction and mentions this French philosopher, Jacques Derrida. Now, for those of us who skipped postmodern philosophy in college, what is Derrida's whole deal and how is it being weaponized today?
It's a heavy concept, but let's break it down simply. Derrida basically argued that you should forget the dictionary. He claimed that words don't actually point to objective, absolute facts in the real world. Instead, he believed that language merely constructs power dynamics. Words just reveal who has the power in a society and who doesn't.
So saying the sky's blue isn't an objective fact, it's just a statement made by someone with the power to define colors.
In a simplistic sense, yes. The book argues that modern activists took Derrida's highly academic theory and weaponized it to literally rewrite reality. The logic is terrifyingly simple. If you can control the words people are allowed to use, you can control what they are capable of thinking. And the text provides a startling example of how this forced destabilization of language is affecting actual human cognitive function.
Right, the Harvard study, I wanted to ask about this. The book cites a 2023 study regarding gender-neutral language. What did they find?
The study found that students who are exposed to reading materials filled with gender-neutral language and complex new neopronoun structures actually scored 18% lower on basic reading comprehension tests compared to students reading standard English.
18% lower, just from changing the pronouns. How does the book interpret that data?
The author's takeaway is that forcing people to adopt an unnatural, ideologically driven linguistic framework doesn't make them more enlightened or progressive. It literally makes them less capable of processing and understanding information. Why? Because the reader's brain is constantly expending vital cognitive energy just trying to navigate the linguistic minefield, terrified of committing a language crime, rather than actually absorbing the substance of the text.
That makes so much sense. You're so focused on not saying the wrong word that you forget what you were even talking about.
Yeah.
And the author shares this personal anecdote in the book that really drives home how absurd this language policing has gotten. He talks about sitting in a university faculty meeting.
Yes. He describes a meeting where a fellow professor, seriously, with no irony, stated that the word man was inherently offensive and patriarchal, and proposed that it needed to be replaced by the word humans in all official university documentation.
Which is just so perfectly ironic, right? Because the word human literally has the word man inside it.
Exactly. The text highlights the absolute absurdity of this, noting the Latin roots and the fundamental lack of etymological understanding. But the author's deeper point is that the activists enforcing these rules don't care about etymology, history, or logic. They only care about destabilizing basic definitions to exert control. If they can make a grown adult feel anxious about uttering a word as fundamental and ancient as man, they have successfully established dominance over that person's reality.
And this isn't just happening in absurd faculty meetings where people argue over semantics. It is literally being encoded into federal law and global corporate policy. The book details the criminalization of pronouns, which is a massive, massive talking point in the manosphere. Let's look at Canada's Bill C-16. This was passed back in 2017. What exactly did this bill do, and why does the author see it as such a massive threat?
Bill C-16 added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. Now, proponents argue it was just about protecting a vulnerable minority from discrimination. But critics, including the author of this book, pointed out the mechanical reality of the law. By classifying gender identity as a protected class alongside race or religion, the law effectively made misgendering someone, using the wrong pronoun, a potential human rights violation and potentially a criminal offense under hate speech provisions.
So it's not just saying you can't say this bad word, it's saying you must say this specific word. It's compelled speech.
Exactly. That is the critical distinction the text makes. It's one thing for the government to say, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. That's restricting speech for safety. It is a completely different, much more tyrannical thing for the government to say, you must use these specific plural pronouns to describe this singular individual or you will be fined. And the book provides real-world examples of these consequences. It discusses a case in British Columbia where a man was fined $2,500 by a human rights tribunal simply for refusing to use a non-binary person's preferred pronouns in a workplace dispute.
Fined thousands of dollars for grammar. And it's happening in tech, too. The book cites a Google Workspace update from 2022.
Yes, the 2022 update actively prompted users and allowed them to officially display their preferred pronouns across all Google communication apps, Gmail, Docs, etc. But the text notes a very telling, deeply hypocritical detail. The Google system was designed to accept progressive ideological pronouns, like they slash them or various newly invented neo-pronouns, but it actively rejected joke pronouns or attempts by users to mock the system. For instance, if a user tried to input king or his majesty as their pronoun, the system blocked it.
So it wasn't actually about expressing your authentic self, it was about expressing an approved version of yourself.
Exactly. The author argues this proves the system isn't about personal expression at all. It's a mechanism for enforcing a very specific ideological compliance. If it were truly about self-identification, king would be just as valid as they/zer.
Let's unpack the emotional core of this for the MRA listener, because I think this is why they hate pronoun mandates so viscerally. It's not just about grammar for them. The author is telling these men that compliance with these language rules is a psychological trap. Let's say a guy is in a corporate office. He gets an email from HR, he rolls his eyes, sighs, and just agrees to they slash them in his email signature or use it for a coworker just to keep the peace and be polite. The book argues that guy isn't actually being polite, right? What is he doing?
The text argues that he is committing an act of forced submission that degrades his own integrity. The author asserts that agreeing to use plural pronouns for a singular person or female pronouns for a biological male is forcing a man to vocalize a lie. He is submitting to a reality where biological truth is officially erased. The book explicitly tells its readers that in this modern culture war, neutrality is labeled as complicity by the activist. You cannot just opt out of the language game. If you refuse to speak the new language, you are targeted as a dissident. Therefore, simply speaking the objective truth, even when it's just maintaining basic biological grammar, becomes an act of necessary radical rebellion.
That is a powerful framing for someone who already feels alienated. It turns them from a disgruntled employee into a truth teller, which naturally leads into the next major argument of the text, the erosion of free speech and the rise of what the author calls big tech totalitarianism. The book asks the reader to look at where all this speech is actually being controlled. It's not just in the HR office, it's in the digital public square. But the author argues that the idea of a digital town square is a complete illusion.
It is a total illusion, according to the text, because it's completely monopolized. The book points out that a tiny elite cartel of massive corporations, specifically Google, Meta, Amazon, and Apple, control roughly 92% of all digital speech and infrastructure. They are the unelected landlords of the internet. If they don't want you to be heard, you don't exist.
And it gets darker, because the book cites a 2022 study from Stanford University about how this algorithmic control is actually changing user psychology. It uses this incredible, terrifying phrase, Stockholm Syndrome with Wi-Fi. What does that mean?
That phrase perfectly captures the Stanford study's implications. The text argues that internet users have become so deeply accustomed to algorithms, quietly filtering out controversial thoughts, shadow banning right-wing accounts, and curating safe spaces, that users are now effectively addicted to their own censorship. They have developed Stockholm Syndrome with the tech platforms that restrict their speech. They now expect, and even actively demand, to be shielded from dissenting opinions. This creates a curated, artificially homogenized reality where users genuinely believe the whole world agrees with them simply because the algorithm deleted everyone who didn't.
And the book has the receipts on how this suppression works mechanically. It doesn't just rely on theory. It brings up the 2022 Twitter files, which were released after Elon Musk bought the platform.
Yes, the Twitter files are central to this argument. The text notes that these leaked internal documents essentially proved what conservatives and red-pilled men had been saying for years. It wasn't paranoia, and it wasn't a conspiracy theory. The algorithm was actively, intentionally suppressing conservative and traditional content, sometimes reducing its visibility by up to 50%.
But they didn't call it censorship internally, did they? They used that creepy corporate speak.
Exactly. The engineers didn't have a button labeled censor conservatives. They used sanitized bureaucratic language. They called it quality filtering, visibility reduction, or de-amplification. But the result, the text argues, was the exact same: the systematic digital erasure of the political right.
The book also does a great job of contrasting how these massive tech platforms treat different political extremes to highlight the bias. It points out that Facebook banned the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, entirely from their platform, years before they took any significant action against the left-wing anarcho-communist group Antifa. And that's despite Antifa having a massive, well-documented history of organizing street violence, riots, and property destruction directly on the platform.
The double standard is the point. The text also highlights the hypocrisy of Amazon Web Services, or AWS. The book details how AWS pulled the plug on the conservative social network Parler, effectively vaporizing them from the internet under the guise of stopping hate speech and protecting democracy. Yet at the exact same time, AWS continued to proudly host and provide server space for websites that disseminated official propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow, so an American conservative app is too dangerous to host, but the CCP is totally fine. That really lays bare the ideological alignment.
It does. The text frames this as a total inversion of morality. It dissects the specific hypocrisy of video platforms like YouTube to hammer this home. The author notes that YouTube has routinely demonetized, age-restricted, or suppressed the lectures of Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, Peterson became famous for discussing clinical psychology, the importance of grammar, biblical lectures, and telling young men to clean their rooms and take personal responsibility. But because of his traditional views on gender and biology, his content is flagged as dangerous or hateful.
And what does YouTube promote instead?
The exact opposite. At the exact same time they are suppressing Peterson, the text points out that YouTube freely hosts, promotes, and monetizes videos of taxpayer-funded drag queen story hours aimed at toddlers. The author is pointing out to his readers that the tech platforms are declaring a clinical psychologist lecturing on the importance of biological reality to be a threat to public safety, while simultaneously declaring adult men performing in drag for 5-year-olds to be wholesome, educational, advertiser-friendly content.
It's an inverted reality. And the book takes aim at legacy civil rights organizations too, right? Like the ADL and the SPLC.
Yes, the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. The text notes that these organizations historically did important work fighting actual violent hate groups like the KKK. But today, the book argues, they have redefined the word hate so broadly and so politically that they now label mainstream conservative organizations as hate groups simply for stating that there are only two biological sexes, male and female. And because big tech platforms use the ADL and SPLC as their moral compasses for content moderation, that definition of hate becomes the algorithmic law of the internet.
So if we step back, what is the terrifying premise the book is asking the listener to consider here?
The premise is this. If a tiny handful of tech platforms and heavily biased activist organizations have the unchecked power to decide that fundamental biological facts are misinformation, and that traditional Christian or conservative beliefs are hate speech, then the internet is no longer a tool for human connection or free expression. It has become a global mechanism for cognitive dissent punishment. If you think the wrong thought, if you state a fact that makes the wrong demographic uncomfortable, you are algorithmically ghosted, demonetized, or financially unbanked. The text argues that this isn't just about some guy losing his Twitter account. It is about the deliberate, systematic erasure of traditional men from the public consciousness entirely.
And according to the book, this erasure isn't just stopping at the digital border. It is aggressively subverting what the author calls sacred spaces in the real world. This section of the text is really where it taps into the profound sense of loss and grief felt by traditional men. It starts by detailing the ideological capture of the church. Now, obviously, religion has always been a massive pillar for traditional masculinity. How does the book quantify the fall of the church?
It cites a staggering statistic that perfectly illustrates the shift. Between 2005 and 2020, there was a 239% rise in mainline Protestant churches officially affirming homosexuality, performing same-sex marriages, and fundamentally altering traditional biblical teachings on gender and sexuality.
A 239% rise in just 15 years. That's not a slow evolution, that's a collapse.
Exactly. And the text argues that for the traditional men who built, funded, and sustained these communities for generations, watching the pulpit abandon Orthodox scripture in favor of modern identity politics is a profound, deeply personal betrayal. The author views these affirming progressive churches not as evolved religious institutions, but as woke nonprofits with communion. The argument is that they have traded sacred, eternal doctrine for cheap, temporary cultural compliance. They bow to the conveyor belt.
From the church, the text moves to the military and youth programs. Historically, these were the primary vehicles for taking boys and instilling them with traditional masculinity, discipline, and a sense of duty. And the book focuses heavily on the Boy Scouts.
Yes. The Boy Scouts of America, facing immense cultural and financial pressure, eventually changed their name to Scouts BSA and completely altered their membership policies. They began allowing biological males who self-identify as girls into programs meant for girls, and vice versa.
And the book highlights the visceral, physical reality of this policy change. What does it actually look like on the ground?
The text points out that the real-world result of this policy is biological males who are going through male puberty, sharing tents in the woods with young girls. The author argues that an organization that was once globally respected for dedicating itself to teaching boys survival skills, moral integrity, and the heavy responsibility of manhood has completely abandoned its foundational duty to protect children, all to appease the demands of progressive activists.
We already touched on the U.S. Air Force threatening cultural fitness consequences for service members who avoid pride events, which shows the military capture. But the book also points to the justice system, specifically prisons, which I found fascinating. What is happening in the prison system?
The text notes that prison systems in highly progressive states like California are increasingly replacing hard labor and vocational work programs with things like mindfulness retreats, where violent inmates sit in circles and journal about their feelings and emotional trauma.
Instead of swinging a hammer or learning a trade, they are doing group therapy.
Right, and the author argues this is a fatal, almost comical misunderstanding of male psychology and how to rehabilitate antisocial, violent men. The text asserts that you do not fix a broken criminal man by feminizing his environment and treating him like a fragile victim. You fix him through strict, unwavering discipline, physical exhaustion, and forcing him to engage in productive, difficult labor that builds actual self-worth.
All of this institutional capture, the church, the military, the prisons, it all culminates in what the book identifies as the ultimate final target of the degeneracy conveyor, the prize they are really after, and that is the next generation, specifically young children. The book brings up a truly chilling example from a Swedish preschool.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through this incident?
This is one of the most intense anecdotes in the text. A teacher in a Swedish preschool was caught on video during nap time. She approaches a half-asleep 5-year-old child and softly asks, "Do you want to be a princess today?"
A 5-year-old,
Yeah.
just waking up from a nap.
Yes. And the text analyzes this interaction intensely. The author points out that this is not a case of a child organically expressing gender dysphoria or asking questions. This is an adult in a trusted position of immense authority, actively planting the seed in a highly suggestible toddler's mind that biological sex is meaningless and that gender is just something you put on and take off like a costume from a dress-up box.
It's pure indoctrination.
The text argues exactly that. The author's warning to fathers reading the book is stark and urgent. The ultimate goal of this ideology isn't just to win arguments on Twitter. The goal is to physically and psychologically separate children from traditional family structures and biological reality. By deliberately confusing children about their fundamental nature at the earliest possible age, the ideology seeks to sever the bond between parent and child. It seeks to replace the biological father, who would naturally protect the child from this confusion, with the state, the progressive school administration, and the gender therapist. The text argues that the system actively wants to alienate fathers who try to protect their kids, quickly labeling the protective traditional father as a danger to the child's self-expression so he can be removed from the equation.
It is incredibly bleak when you look at it all laid out like that. But the book doesn't end in despair, right? The final section of the text is essentially a battle plan. It's a call to arms for the resistance, specifically focused on the awakening of the red-pilled man and the strategy for reclaiming the West. It asks, how did the pushback finally start? Where are the cracks in the matrix? And it points to massive working-class movements.
Yes, it highlights moments where the conveyor belt met immovable resistance. It brings up the 2022 Canadian trucker protests. This was a massive event where thousands of working-class men physically drove their big rigs into the capital city and shut it down to protest draconian vaccine mandates and government overreach.
And the government's response to that was unprecedented. They literally froze the bank accounts of the protesters.
They did. But despite the state using extreme financial warfare, the text sees the trucker protest as a massive, pivotal moment of awakening. It was the moment where traditional working men suddenly remembered how to collectively say no to institutional tyranny. The text also points back to Jordan Peterson's original Lonely Stand in 2016. That was when he explicitly, publicly refused to use compelled neopronouns dictated by the Canadian government. And the text emphasizes that Peterson didn't do it to be hateful or mean. He did it simply because he refused to let the state force him to speak a biological lie.
He drew a line in the sand on reality itself. And the book mentions the 2022 Men's March in Austin, Texas, too.
Yes, as a physical manifestation of this awakening. It sees events like the Men's March as a sign that men are finally beginning to physically gather in the real world outside of digital echo chambers, to openly reject the mainstream narrative that their existence is toxic.
This leads to the book's overarching defense of the manosphere as a whole. Now, when the mainstream media talks about groups like incels or MGTOW, which stands for men going their own way, or just the brighter red pill community, they almost universally frame them as dangerous, radicalized, potential domestic terrorists, or just bitter misogynists. But the author completely rejects this framing. How does he redefine these groups for the reader?
The author provides a deeply empathetic defense of these men. He explains to the reader that these men are not the radical extremists the media portrays them to be. They are simply men who notice the scam and refuse to play. Let's take MGTOW, for example, men going their own way. The text argues that men who actively choose to walk away from marriage, who refuse to cohabitate with women, or who gather in online spaces to discuss the harsh realities of female hypergamy.
Wait, real quick, for the listener who hasn't heard that term, what exactly is female hypogamy in this context?
Female hypergamy is the sociobiological concept that women naturally, instinctively seek to marry across or up the socioeconomic ladder. They seek mates who are taller, stronger, wealthier, or higher status than themselves. The Red Pill community discusses this extensively to explain why average men feel invisible to women in the modern dating market.
Got it. Okay, so these men are discussing hypergamy and family court bias, and the author says they are entirely justified.
Yes. The text argues that these men are making a perfectly rational, logical choice in a system that is completely rigged against them. They looked at the Degeneracy Conveyor. They saw that the end result of participating in the modern marriage or corporate system was their own financial ruin and psychological destruction. And instead of playing a rigged game, they simply decided to step off the belt entirely. They aren't terrorists, they are dropouts.
So what is the author's actual practical survival strategy for the normal guy reading this book who wants to resist but still has to live in the world? What does he do on Monday morning?
The core motto the text provides is, awareness is armor. The author tells his readers that the absolute most powerful thing a man can do is to simply, quietly, firmly stop participating in the illusion.
Just opt out.
Exactly. Don't go to the optional HR diversity training. If they make it mandatory, sit there and say nothing. Don't spend your hard-earned money buying products from mega corporations that virtue signal their hatred of traditional masculinity. Hit them in the wallet. And most importantly, do not ever, under any circumstances, apologize for speaking the rational biological truth.
So if someone at work demands you use a neopronoun for them?
The book says politely but firmly refuse. Do not participate in the lie. If a school administration tries to teach your young child that they can magically change their biological sex, the author says pull the child out of the school immediately, or organize with other fathers and fight the school board ruthlessly. The overarching message of the text is that the entire corrupt system relies entirely on the silent, cowardly compliance of normal, everyday men. The moment normal men stop nodding along just to keep the peace, the moment they say no, the entire ideological illusion shatters.
And the author emphasizes that men shouldn't do this alone, right?
Crucially, yes. He urges men to form strong, tight-knit, real-world networks of support with other red-pilled men. If you are isolated, you can be canceled, fired, and ruined. But if you have a network of men supporting you, you become uncancelable. And above all else, his final directive is regarding children. He tells his readers to intentionally raise sons who are not medicated for having natural, boisterous, aggressive male energy. He wants men to raise a hardened generation of boys who are completely immune to the guilt, shame, and pathologizing that the current system uses as its primary weapons of control.
It is an intensely heavy, relentless read. And after unpacking all of this, it is crystal clear why this book has become such a foundational, sacred text for so many men right now. It gives them a unified theory for everything they're feeling. We uncover the Marxist roots of repressive tolerance, the feminist institutional capture of the courts and HR, the weaponization of language to compelled speech, and the ultimate call to resistance. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought that builds on everything this book has laid out.
Let's consider the macro implications of the text's thesis. The author argues that civilizations die from internal rot when they stop enforcing objective standards and abandon the ruthless pursuit of excellence in favor of soft ideological compliance. We see this in the text's examples. Universities prioritizing diversity statements over actual scientific breakthrough, and the military prioritizing pride parades and cultural fitness over lethal combat readiness. This raises a terrifying existential question for you to mull over. If the core load-bearing institutions of the West, our military, our scientific academy, our justice system, our engineering sectors, have fully replaced the pursuit of merit with the pursuit of ideological inclusion, what happens when those institutions are finally forced to face a purely objective external crisis?
You mean a crisis where feelings don't matter?
Exactly. What happens when an ideology-focused, hypersensitive military is forced into a major global conflict against a ruthless adversary that only cares about lethal efficiency and victory? What happens when a university system focused on decolonizing engineering has to build bridges and power grids that must withstand the unforgiving, objective laws of physics? The chilling subtext of this entire book is that objective reality cannot be deconstructed, and when the ideological illusion we've built eventually inevitably crashes into cold, hard, objective reality, the collapse of these captured institutions will be catastrophic.
That is an incredibly heavy thought to end on, but it is exactly the kind of bracing question this book forces its readers to confront. I want to remind everyone listening that today's deep dive was an objective exploration of Conrad Reicher's highly controversial, deeply impactful manifesto. We did not take sides today, but we wanted to give you a thorough, unvarnished, deep look at the specific arguments and the mechanical logic driving a massive, growing cultural movement.
Thanks for listening.
Yes, and if this breakdown hooked you, if you want to read the raw data, see the full historical timelines, and digest the complete arguments for yourself, you need to go buy the ebook right now. It is available on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books. Once again, it's called Degeneracy Conveyor. And do not forget to follow the author directly at the handle at Conrad Reicher on Substack to stay updated on his latest writings, essays, and cultural analysis.
Definitely go check it out.
Finally, if you appreciated this level of intense detail, the historical context, and the objective breakdown we provided today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.